Hale. I'm 35 years old, and at 9:06 on a Saturday night, I was standing under the blue-white museum lights in a black silk dress that still smelled faintly like printer heat, dry florist stems, and the coffee I had spilled on my wrist while reconciling pledge sheets 3 hours earlier, when my brother took a microphone and tried to turn me into the Foundation's problem in front of everyone who mattered. We were inside the atrium at the fundraising gala, all glass walls, donor tables, floating candlelight, and the kind of expensive charity atmosphere built to make power look generous. Damien had just finished smiling through a pledge announcement when he said I had been poisoning things from the inside because I couldn't stand seeing anyone else lead. The room made that tight, awful silence rich people make when they sense scandal, but hope it will still be elegant. I opened my mouth to answer, and my mother cut across me without even looking in my direction. She told security to escort me out before I created another scene. Another scene, as if I were the chaos in that room and not the woman who had spent years making sure their chaos never reached donor eyesight. I remember one trustee lowering her champagne glass very slowly. I remember a sponsor's wife turning toward her husband with her eyebrows raised. I remember my father staying still in that polished coward way of his, like if he didn't move, he wouldn't have to choose. I did not fight security. I did not grab the microphone back. I just stood there and understood, with perfect clarity, that the accusation was too prepared to be spontaneous. This was not a family eruption. It was cover. And by Tuesday morning, after I stopped correcting the paper trail they thought I would keep correcting forever, the first sponsor started asking questions they could no longer answer cleanly. Before I tell you what started breaking first, tell me what time it is where you are and where you're watching from. I always wonder how far stories like this travel before they land in front of someone who already knows what legacy really costs. If you had asked my family that night what I actually did for the foundation, they would have handed you a polished lie small enough to keep me in the right corner of the picture. They would have called me detail-oriented, reliable, strong with the administrative side. What they would not have said was that I was the financial and compliance spine of the entire institution. My mother loved legacy language, donor dinners, and photographs with her hand on somebody else's gratitude. Damien loved stages, urgent promises, and the kind of charisma that sounds visionary right up until somebody has to document it. My father loved whatever version of peace required the least courage. And me, I was the one who made the machinery survive reality. Sponsor contracts, pledge verification, reimbursement controls, restricted fund reporting, procurement logs, grant deadlines, vendor sequencing, audit prep. I handled the work that turns a family vanity project into something that can survive scrutiny. That pattern did not begin with the gala. It had been the family religion for years. Damien got forgiven in advance. I got trusted with cleanup in advance. When he promised a corporate sponsor private access that had never been approved, my mother called it relationship building and asked me to make the paperwork match the spirit of the commitment. When an event budget ran hot because Damien wanted upgraded staging, floral installs, and branded donor gifts his initiative could not actually cover, I was the one who reclassified expenses, rebuilt reimbursement packets, and made sure the restricted fund language did not trigger immediate alarm. My father would thank me in that exhausted, almost embarrassed tone men like him use when they know a woman is saving them and plan to let it keep happening. Then the next day, he would stand beside my brother at lunch and act like leadership had naturally arrived in the right sun-shaped container. Even the staff learned the hierarchy. Damien made declarations. I made them possible or less dangerous. My mother spoke about impact. I translated impact into reports, reconciliations, and vendor checks that cleared on time. Trustees praised his energy and emailed me quietly when they wanted accurate numbers. Sponsors loved his confidence and trusted my follow-through. That was the hidden system. He was the face. I was the proof. He was allowed to overpromise because the family had trained itself to believe I would always be there after midnight cleaning the record into something defensible. So when my mother told security to remove me from that gala, what she was really doing was choosing the public heir over the daughter who knew where the contradictions lived. I was never the one they planned to celebrate. I was the one they planned to use until using me became visible. The wrong question would have been why Damien humiliated me in public like that. The right question was why he needed to do it before anyone had formally accused the foundation of anything at all. I did not come to that answer emotionally. I came to it the way I came to most truths in that family, by tracing sequence instead of tone. Sunday morning, I sat in my condo in Midtown with my laptop open, a yellow legal pad beside me, and the gala program still folded on the counter like evidence from a crime scene nobody wanted to name. I replayed the moment in my head, not because I needed to relive it, but because the wording was too neat to be spontaneous. Poisoning things from the inside, creating another scene, bitter, difficult. Those are not family fight words. Those are containment words. They travel well. They give trustees a frame. They give staff permission to distance themselves. They give donors an explanation ready-made if ugly questions start surfacing later. That was the first real crack. They were not reacting to me. They were preparing the room for the records. I have spent years working nonprofit finance and compliance in institutions where image runs ahead of controls. I know what happens when people with big public energy start confusing a pledge with cash, a restricted fund with a general slush line, or a sponsor promise with something already approved by contract. That kind of chaos stays charming right up until a board packet goes out or an outside reviewer starts asking why a reimbursement trail looks cleaner than the underlying expense behavior. I understood that better than anyone in my family because I was always the one closest to the back-end truth. Damien lived on stages, in cultivation dinners, in visionary language. My mother loved that about him because vision photographs beautifully. But vision without documentation becomes exposure, and exposure was what I had been quietly reducing for years. Once I stopped replaying the humiliation and started reviewing the pattern, certain things became obvious fast. Over the previous quarter, my mother had started asking odd questions about who technically owned sponsor deliverable logs. Damien had twice asked whether I really needed to preserve older internal versions of pledge notes when the final summary told the story just fine. One of the foundation coordinators had started sounding overly careful around me, like she had already been told I was territorial about authority. And 3 weeks before the gala, a trustee named Eleanor Bass had asked me, with dangerous politeness, whether a delayed sponsor packet would interfere with any already announced benefits. At the time, I fixed the problem and kept moving. Sitting at my table Sunday morning, I understood what I had missed. The gala accusation was not the beginning of my discrediting. It was the public installment of a story they had already started placing privately. So I opened my files and built 2 columns, one for operational exposure, one for narrative preparation. Under operational exposure, I listed everything I had been smoothing over. Overdue sponsor deliverables tied to Damien's public promises, donor-restricted funds stretched too close to image-driven event costs, reimbursement packets cleaned up after the underlying purchases had already crossed lines. They should not have crossed, procurement timing manipulated, so certain expenses looked less reckless on paper than they had been in real life. Under narrative preparation, I listed the smaller things that now looked less innocent. My mother telling staff I had become hard to work with lately. Damien asking whether my insistence on documentation was becoming a morale issue. My father saying twice that everyone needed to protect the institution and not let personal resentment blur judgment. Personal resentment. Another useful phrase for a woman who knows too much. By early afternoon, I called the only person on staff I trusted to answer a direct question without turning it into gossip. Her name was Camille Porter, Senior Grants Manager, smart enough to survive a family foundation without ever pretending it was normal. I did not ask whether people had been talking about me. I asked whether Damien had recently changed how sponsor commitments were being described internally. She went quiet, then admitted he had been telling people certain deliverables were essentially handled before final paperwork existed and had started referring to me as someone who struggled to support forward-facing leadership. There it was, forward-facing leadership. My brother's gift, apparently, was promising into the future. Mine was making the future less legally embarrassing after he got there too fast. I thanked Camille, ended the call, and wrote down the sentence that clarified everything. They were not afraid I would embarrass the foundation. They were afraid I would stop translating performance into documentation. Once I had that sentence, the next decision made itself. I was not going to argue with my brother about jealousy or let my mother reduce this to a daughter with hurt feelings. Inventory first, emotion second. I would identify exactly where my name, my approvals, my reporting structure, and my corrective labor still sat inside their machine. Then I would remove myself from it cleanly and let sequence speak without me standing in front of it. By Sunday night, I had a cleaner map than my family ever imagined I could build under pressure, which was almost insulting considering they had spent years leaning on that exact ability while pretending it was merely clerical. I was not hunting for revenge, I was identifying dependency. Sponsor contracts ran through a version control chain I administered. Pledge verification logs sat inside a reporting workflow tied to my credentials. Reimbursement approvals for event-related spending were technically shared, but the exception notes that kept questionable charges from drawing immediate scrutiny had been written, clarified, and sequenced by me. Restricted fund reporting drafts lived in a folder structure I had built after two near-miss review cycles no one but me seemed to remember. Vendor sequencing for the gala, staging, lighting, catering, branded installations, donor gift fulfillment, all of it had been stabilized by private corrective notes and timing work that never made it into anyone's speeches about legacy. I did not delete anything. I did not freeze accounts in anger. I did what a competent compliance director does when she realizes the people calling her unstable are still standing on controls she built. Monday morning, I drafted my resignation, effective immediately, and addressed it to the board chair, outside counsel, my parents, and Damien. I stated that I was resigning from my role as nonprofit finance and compliance director and would no longer authorize sponsor deliverable reconciliations, reimbursement approvals, restricted fund reporting reviews, procurement exception handling, or event payment sequencing. Then I added the line that mattered most. Any use of my name, credentials, approval history, or implied oversight after receipt of this notice was unauthorized. After that, I sent a narrower operational email to our finance systems vendor, the grant reporting consultant, and the internal controller, requesting removal of my live approval authority and reassignment of workflow ownership in writing. No accusation, no flourish, just separation. Then I built the folder I hoped I would never need and knew I absolutely would. Resignation, credential removal requests, system ownership logs, approval chain screenshots, archived workflow notes showing exactly where I had been correcting exposure after the fact. I preserved only what I was entitled to preserve for self-protection and chronology. The point was not to destroy the foundation. The point was to make sure my silence could not be drafted later as consent. The first real crack arrived before lunch. At 10:18, a sponsorship coordinator emailed asking why two promised donor benefits were still marked pending if Damien had already announced them as secured from the stage. At 10:41, a vendor I had kept calm for 3 event cycles wrote that they would no longer release final print materials without payment confirmation because prior flexibility had already been extended. By 11:07, Camille texted from her personal phone that Damien was asking where the reimbursement exception log had gone and why procurement could no longer just move faster like it always did. That phrase sat there on my screen like proof of religion, like it always did, as if the work of making recklessness look operational had been some natural feature of the institution instead of my labor. At 11:32, my mother emailed me with the subject line, "Urgent clarification needed." Not apology, not "can we talk?" Clarification. She wrote that the board was getting nervous, staff were confused, and my emotional withdrawal was harming the mission. Emotional withdrawal. Interesting phrase for a woman who had just been publicly removed by security at her own gala. I did not respond. At 11:49, Damien called. I let it ring out. He texted seconds later, "Stop being dramatic and tell us what got disconnected." I read that twice and felt the story harden into what it had always been. They did not believe I had left. They believed I was still there somewhere inside the machinery, reachable if they said the right combination of blame and entitlement. By Monday afternoon, the Foundation was beginning to discover the difference between systems and the woman who had been quietly making them merciful. And once that difference appears, it is very hard to make it disappear again. The first clean proof came from outside the family, which is usually how you know a private lie has started pressing too hard against the real world. It arrived Monday at 2:06 p.m. in the form of a polite email from one of our largest corporate sponsors asking for confirmation that the premium donor package announced at the gala would, in fact, be delivered on the timeline Damien had described from the stage. Attached was the signed contract. I opened it and felt that cold, familiar stillness settle in my chest. The contract language was narrower than the promise. Much narrower. Damien had publicly described a slate of private access benefits, branded placements, and reporting visibility that had never been fully approved in the final deliverable schedule. I knew because I had already patched 2 earlier drafts to keep the sponsor expectations from outrunning what the Foundation had actually committed to in writing. He had done it again. Only this time I was no longer inside the chain softening the landing. 10 minutes later, the second confirming artifact arrived. A trustee named Eleanor Bass sent a brief message requesting clarification about several reimbursement entries flagged during routine pre-review of gala expenses. She attached a spreadsheet excerpt. 3 charges had been coded in ways I recognized immediately. One event design overage had been folded into a broader cultivation line. A rushed hospitality expense had been made to look more donor-facing than it truly was. And one set of image-driven costs tied to Damien's initiative had been spread across categories that kept the full shape of the spending from looking as reckless as it had been in reality. Nothing there was theatrical. That was the danger. It was boring, administrative, and devastatingly legible to anyone who knew where to look. What mattered was not merely that the records were messy. Foundations survive mess all the time. What mattered was the pattern. Sponsor benefits had been promised before final approval. Restricted or tightly tracked money had been stretched to support image-first costs. Reimbursements had been cleaned up after behavior, not before it. And now that my hands were no longer inside the sequence, the institution was beginning to describe itself honestly. At 3:01, Camille forwarded me an internal staff email thread by accident, then called immediately asking me to ignore it. Too late. I had already seen enough. Damien had written that I was spiraling over perceived disrespect, and that any operational disruption should be understood in light of my increasing instability around leadership transitions. My mother replied all with a sentence so polished it was almost elegant. We need everyone aligned around the fact that Veronica has struggled for some time to separate personal resentment from institutional responsibility. There it was, in writing, not born at the gala, prepared. They were not only taking my labor for granted, they were building a story sturdy enough to survive the moment the records stopped cooperating. I saved the thread where I was allowed to preserve it for self-protection, documented the timestamp, and added it to my folder. The first proof was no longer just financial, it was narrative. They had already framed me as the unstable daughter just in time for the paperwork to start contradicting Damien's stage-managed leadership. At 3:28, Damien called from his direct line. I answered on the fourth ring. He skipped hello. "What exactly are you doing?" he snapped. "Not are you okay, not we need to talk." I looked at the contract still open on my screen and said, "Separating myself from promises you made before approval." He hissed that sponsors were getting nervous, trustees were asking questions, and I was making the Foundation look compromised over a family conflict. Family. Another word they loved to use when they wanted structure to sound emotional. I asked him one question. "Were you already telling people I was bitter before the gala, or did Mom write that line for you?" Silence answered before he did. Then he said, colder now, "You always thought knowing where everything lived made you powerful." I almost laughed because the truth was simpler and uglier than that. I did not think knowing made me powerful. They did. That was why they were panicking. The room became honest on Wednesday morning, not through conscience, but through exposure. That is usually how truth enters institutions like my family's, not with a dramatic confession, with an email nobody can talk around. I was at my dining table with a mug of coffee gone cold beside me, answering one precise message from the systems vendor about approval chain reassignment, when Eleanor Bass wrote again. This time she copied outside counsel, the interim controller, and the board treasurer. Her language was calm enough to be lethal. She said that during routine review, questions had emerged regarding sponsor deliverables, reimbursement categorization, and the use of restricted or designated funds in proximity to gala costs. She requested a written explanation of approval pathways, timing, and responsible parties before the next board meeting. Timing, responsible parties. There it was. The family story was finally colliding with institutional language. Within 15 minutes, Damien called twice, then texted, "Answer me now." I let it sit. Then outside counsel called from a different number, which told me panic had already put on a blazer. His name was Richard Sloane, and unlike Damien, he knew how to sound calm while holding a fire alarm in his hand. He said he hoped we could clarify a few things quickly to prevent unnecessary escalation. I asked him to define unnecessary. There was a pause. Then he shifted into the real problem. Several sponsor benefits announced publicly did not appear fully supported by executed deliverable schedules. Certain expense allocations were drawing scrutiny. The board wanted to understand whether those inconsistencies reflected process breakdown, poor internal communication, or unauthorized adjustments. I almost admired the options he gave me. Institutions love categories that leave room for innocence, so I asked the only question that mattered. Has anyone represented, after my resignation, that I am still overseeing these approvals or that these records were finalized under my authority? He did not answer directly. He said only that my historical role had caused some people to make assumptions. Assumptions. That was enough. My name was still doing labor in rooms I was no longer in. That was all I needed, a path. I opened the folder I had built and started structuring the record the way I would for any risk review. First, the gala accusation and public removal. Second, the resignation. Third, the credential and approval separation notices. Fourth, the sponsor contract mismatch. Fifth, the reimbursement flags. Sixth, the internal email language framing me as unstable before the record surfaced. Seventh, outside counsel's acknowledgement that my historical authority had continued shaping assumptions after my departure. I was no longer dealing with family denial. I was dealing with a documented attempt to preserve image by letting my credibility linger in the background while they prepared to discredit me in the foreground. That kind of maneuver has a very short shelf life once someone starts writing down dates. At 12:40, my mother appeared at my building without warning. The concierge called up first, sounding uncomfortable, and asked whether I was expecting Mrs. Hale. I almost said no out of reflex. Then I said I would meet her downstairs. She was standing in the lobby in cream wool and diamonds, which felt exactly right. My mother always dressed best when reality was least cooperative. She did not open with apology. She opened with optics. "Do you understand what people are beginning to imply?" she asked. "Not what happened to you, not what Damien did. Imply." I said, "I understand what the records are beginning to describe. That's different." She lowered her voice and said the board was overreacting, donors were nervous, and Damien was under impossible pressure. Then she made her real mistake. She said, "If you would just explain the sequence and clean up the approvals, this can still be handled internally." Clean up the approvals. There it was. Not come home, not let's fix this as a family. Clean up. She had security remove me in front of donors, and now wanted my competence back in private before the donors started reading too closely. I asked her, "Did you already tell trustees I was difficult before the gala, or only after you needed a reason for the records to look strange?" She froze for half a second, then recovered into that controlled maternal sadness she used whenever she wanted cruelty to sound like disappointment. "You have been resentful for a long time," she said. "People have noticed." Resentful, another polished word for a woman who knows where the numbers stop matching the speech. I looked at her and understood something with almost no pain left in it. My family did not think of me as a daughter with boundaries. They thought of me as an internal mechanism that had become inconveniently self-aware. That was the real war. Not affection, not inheritance, control over the point where image met record. I'm not fixing this, I said. You don't get to erase me on stage and then borrow my accuracy off stage. Her face changed then, not into remorse, into fear. Good. Fear was more honest than legacy ever was. By late afternoon, Richard Sloane wrote again, asking whether I would join a call with him, Damien, and the board treasurer, for limited factual clarification only. Limited factual clarification only. I smiled when I read that because once people start using phrases like that, the room is already telling the truth. They no longer wanted family harmony. They wanted containment. They wanted my knowledge without my return. They wanted the benefits of the woman they had thrown out without having to admit why the institution felt so unstable without her in it. That was when I knew the collapse was no longer personal. It had crossed into structure. And structure, once it starts failing in public, does not care who cried first. The room became honest on Wednesday morning, not through conscience, but through exposure. That is usually how truth enters institutions like my family's, not with a dramatic confession, with an email nobody can talk around. I was at my dining table with a mug of coffee gone cold beside me, answering one precise message from the systems vendor about approval chain reassignment, when Eleanor Bass wrote again. This time she copied outside counsel, the interim controller, and the board treasurer. Her language was calm enough to be lethal. She said that during routine review, questions had emerged regarding sponsor deliverables, reimbursement categorization, and the use of restricted or designated funds in proximity to gala costs. She requested a written explanation of approval pathways, timing, and responsible parties before the next board meeting. Timing, responsible parties. There it was. The family story was finally colliding with institutional language. Within 15 minutes, Damien called twice, then texted, "Answer me now." I let it sit. Then outside counsel called from a different number, which told me panic had already put on a blazer. His name was Richard Sloane, and unlike Damien, he knew how to sound calm while holding a fire alarm in his hand. He said he hoped we could clarify a few things quickly to prevent unnecessary escalation. I asked him to define unnecessary. There was a pause. Then he shifted into the real problem. Several sponsor benefits announced publicly did not appear fully supported by executed deliverable schedules. Certain expense allocations were drawing scrutiny. The board wanted to understand whether those inconsistencies reflected process breakdown, poor internal communication, or unauthorized adjustments. I almost admired the options he gave me. Institutions love categories that leave room for innocence, so I asked the only question that mattered. Has anyone represented, after my resignation, that I am still overseeing these approvals or that these records were finalized under my authority? He did not answer directly. He said only that my historical role had caused some people to make assumptions. Assumptions. That was enough. My name was still doing labor in rooms I was no longer in. That was all I needed, a path. I opened the folder I had built and started structuring the record the way I would for any risk review. First, the gala accusation and public removal. Second, the resignation. Third, the credential and approval separation notices. Fourth, the sponsor contract mismatch. Fifth, the reimbursement flags. Sixth, the internal email language framing me as unstable before the record surfaced. Seventh, outside counsel's acknowledgement that my historical authority had continued shaping assumptions after my departure. I was no longer dealing with family denial. I was dealing with a documented attempt to preserve image by letting my credibility linger in the background while they prepared to discredit me in the foreground. That kind of maneuver has a very short shelf life once someone starts writing down dates. At 12:40, my mother appeared at my building without warning. The concierge called up first, sounding uncomfortable, and asked whether I was expecting Mrs. Hale. I almost said no out of reflex. Then I said I would meet her downstairs. She was standing in the lobby in cream wool and diamonds, which felt exactly right. My mother always dressed best when reality was least cooperative. She did not open with apology. She opened with optics. "Do you understand what people are beginning to imply?" she asked. "Not what happened to you, not what Damien did. Imply. I said, I understand what the records are beginning to describe. That's different. She lowered her voice and said the board was overreacting, donors were nervous, and Damien was under impossible pressure. Then she made her real mistake. She said, if you would just explain the sequence and clean up the approvals, this can still be handled internally. Clean up the approvals. There it was. Not come home, not let's fix this as a family. Clean up. She had security remove me in front of donors, and now wanted my competence back in private before the donors started reading too closely. I asked her, did you already tell trustees I was difficult before the gala, or only after you needed a reason for the records to look strange? She froze for half a second, then recovered into that controlled maternal sadness she used whenever she wanted cruelty to sound like disappointment. You have been resentful for a long time, she said. People have noticed. Resentful, another polished word for a woman who knows where the numbers stop matching the speech. I looked at her and understood something with almost no pain left in it. My family did not think of me as a daughter with boundaries. They thought of me as an internal mechanism that had become inconveniently self-aware. That was the real war. Not affection, not inheritance. Control over the point where image met record. I'm not fixing this, I said. You don't get to erase me on stage and then borrow my accuracy off stage. Her face changed then. Not into remorse. Into fear. Good. Fear was more honest than legacy ever was. By late afternoon, Richard Sloane wrote again, asking whether I would join a call with him, Damien, and the board treasurer, for limited factual clarification only. Limited factual clarification only. I smiled when I read that because once people start using phrases like that, the room is already telling the truth. They no longer wanted family harmony. They wanted containment. They wanted my knowledge without my return. They wanted the benefits of the woman they had thrown out without having to admit why the institution felt so unstable without her in it. That was when I knew the collapse was no longer personal. It had crossed into structure. And structure, once it starts failing in public, does not care who cried first. By Thursday, panic had formalized into written positioning, which is the point where I stop trusting anyone's tone and start trusting their subject lines. Richard Sloane sent a document request at 8:12 a.m., asking for confirmation of my resignation date, the timing of my approval withdrawal, the scope of systems previously under my control, and whether I had retained any records relevant to current board concerns. He also asked whether I would consider a temporary advisory role to support continuity pending review. Temporary advisory role. There it was again. A polished phrase for come back and hold the floor up while we decide how much of this we can still hide. I answered in numbered paragraphs. Date of resignation, date of credential separation, confirmation that I had preserved only those materials necessary to document my withdrawal, workflow ownership, and chronology for self-protection. Confirmation that I would not advise, remediate, or informally assist in correcting any sponsor, reimbursement, reporting, or procurement issue. Then I added the line that mattered most. Any instability now visible should not be characterized as sabotage, but as dependency previously concealed by undocumented corrective labor. I read that sentence twice before sending it because once truth is written down cleanly, people have to work much harder to pretend they never understood it. Then I started building the packet properly, not emotionally, structurally, gala accusation, public removal, resignation, credential withdrawal, sponsor contract mismatch, reimbursement flags, internal narrative prep emails, outside counsel, acknowledgement that my historical authority was still shaping assumptions after my exit. I gave each item a date, source, and one-sentence relevance note. Subject lines matter, order matters. Silence matters too. I was no longer trying to make my family admit what they had done. I was separating my name from their conduct with enough precision that no one serious could later confuse the two. At 10:04, Damien sent a message that finally dropped the institutional voice and revealed the family one underneath it. Don't do this to us over pride. I stared at that sentence for a full minute because it contained our whole upbringing in 9 words. His overpromising was vision. My refusal was pride. His recklessness was leadership. My accuracy was betrayal. I wrote back only once. This is not pride. It is the end of unpaid correction. Then I muted him again. My mother followed at noon with something uglier because it tried to sound noble. Blood should matter more than records. That line would have worked on me 10 years ago, maybe even 3 years ago. But hierarchy had always hidden inside words like blood, loyalty, grace, family. In our house, those words did not mean protection. They meant immunity for whoever held the microphone. I saved her message to the folder and wrote a note under it. Family language invoked at the moment of evidentiary exposure. Sometimes naming a tactic is the fastest way to stop bleeding from it. Around 2 o'clock, Camille texted from her personal phone that 2 vendors had stopped extending informal grace and were now asking for written approval histories before proceeding on anything tied to Damien's initiatives. One trustee had apparently asked in a meeting whether finance oversight had ever been bypassed for cultivation reasons, which is the kind of sentence that can make an entire institution start sweating through its tailoring. I thanked her, told her again not to put herself in the middle unless absolutely necessary, and added the update to the chronology. Private chaos was becoming formal concern. That was the shift my family had spent years trusting me to prevent. That evening, I printed the packet and slid it into a plain folder. No dramatic label, no clever tab names. Just dates, sequence, sources, and the quiet dignity of a clean record. Panic can shout, plead, threaten, or sentimentalize. Paper does not. Paper just waits for someone honest enough to read it. My father asked me to meet Saturday morning in the foundation offices before staff arrived, which told me everything before I even answered. He called it one adult conversation. My mother called it a chance to stop this from becoming bigger than it already was. Damien texted nothing at all, which usually meant he was either furious or frightened enough to let our mother speak for him. I went because there are moments when showing up is not hope, it is confirmation. The offices sat on the third floor of a restored brick building off Peachtree, all glass conference walls, framed mission statements, and donor plaques polished to a glow that had always felt vaguely accusatory to me, like gratitude itself had become decor. They were all there when I walked in. My mother at the head of the conference table in a cream suit that made her look expensive and tired. Damien beside her, jaw set, tapping one finger against a legal pad he had no intention of using. My father by the windows with his hands in his pockets, performing seriousness. No one offered coffee. No one said, "I'm sorry." My mother began with the sentence families use when they want tone to erase sequence. Things were said in the heat of the moment. I set my folder on the table and looked at her. "You told security to remove me in front of sponsors and trustees," I said. "That was not heat, that was choreography." My father stepped in too fast, asking all of us to be practical. The board was nervous. Vendors were tightening, donors were calling. The institution mattered more than personal grievances. There it was, personal grievances. Another polished phrase for a woman who knows too much. Damien finally leaned forward and said what they had all been circling. "You knew exactly what would happen if you walked away. You wanted this place to wobble." I opened the folder, laid the chronology on the table between us, and said, "No, I knew what I had been holding up." Then I walked them through it, not emotionally, sequentially. The gala accusation, my forced removal, my resignation, the approval withdrawal, the sponsor contract mismatch, the reimbursement flags, the internal emails framing me as unstable before any of this surfaced. Outside counsel acknowledging that my prior authority was still shaping assumptions after I left. My mother tried to interrupt twice. My father asked whether this was helping. Damien muttered that I was making ordinary institutional strain sound sinister. I did not argue adjectives. I just placed dates in order and let them do what dates do when they finally get a room to themselves. My mother was the first one to crack and say something real. "You have always enjoyed making us feel small because you understand systems and other people don't," she said. It was such an honest sentence I almost thanked her right then. Not "we hurt you," not "we were wrong." You understand systems. Damien followed with his own version of the truth. You could have fixed the rough edges quietly like you always do, but instead you decided to make me look reckless in front of the board. I looked at him and felt the last excuse die. Not the image, I said. The records. That landed. I could see it in his face. Because Damien had always known, somewhere underneath the charm and speeches, that his leadership only looked clean because somebody else kept scrubbing the underside of it. My father rubbed his forehead and said, almost pleading, "What do you want from us?" It was the first real question anyone in my family had asked since the gala. I answered without thinking. Distance, documentation, and no further use of my name, approvals, or silence. My mother tried one last move. After everything this family built, you would do this to your own blood? She asked. I closed the folder. No, I said. You built a story. I built the structure under it. And you do not want repair. You want the old arrangement back. No one denied it. Damien looked down. My father said nothing. My mother's face hardened because control was slipping and there was no respectable way to call it love anymore. I stood, picked up my folder, and left them there in that glass room with the one thing they had spent years trying to avoid, a clean sequence they could not charm, outtalk, or escort out of the building. The fallout spread the way real collapse always does, sideways first, then upward. By Monday afternoon, 2 sponsors had requested written clarification about benefits Damien had publicly described but never fully contracted. One major vendor stopped work until outstanding approvals were confirmed by someone with actual authority instead of the family. The board treasurer requested a side review of reimbursement categories tied to gala spending, and the restricted funds question Eleanor Bass had raised stopped sounding like a technical concern and started sounding like the kind of phrase that gets repeated in rooms with counsel present. Truth had stopped belonging only to my family. It was moving through institutional channels now. Staff felt it too. Camille sent me one final message from her personal phone before I told her, gently, not to put herself at risk for me. Damien was trying to run everything louder, which only made the contradictions easier to see. He kept promising people answers by end of day, without understanding what those answers required. The finance assistant had started flagging transactions instead of smoothing them. Procurement was refusing verbal approvals. One sponsor contact had apparently asked, in a meeting full of people trying to stay calm, who was actually keeping this coordinated before? That question mattered more than any accusation, because once an institution starts asking who was really doing the work, the mythology around leadership begins to thin. My mother tried one last recruitment attempt on Tuesday night. She left me a voicemail soft enough to sound almost maternal again. She said the foundation had given our family purpose. She said Damien was under unbearable pressure. She said my father had not been sleeping. Then the real ask arrived under all that borrowed sorrow. If you would just help us through the board review and stabilize the sponsor pieces, we can handle everything else later. Handle everything else later. Meaning my humiliation, the gala, the years of hierarchy, the narrative they built to pre-discredit me. All of it could wait, apparently, as long as I resumed being useful on schedule. I saved the transcript and deleted the voicemail. Then I sent one response by email to Richard Sloan and copied no family members. I will not participate in transition, correction, advisory work, or informal clarification beyond documented chronology already provided. Any statement that I remain involved or available is inaccurate. It was a short email. It felt like a locked gate. By Thursday, the board had authorized an outside compliance review of sponsor commitments, reimbursement classifications, and restricted fund handling tied to recent programming and gala costs. Not a raid, not a scandal headline, something worse for people like my family. A clean review, the kind that asks for source documents, dates, sign-offs, and sequence without raising its voice. Damien texted me that night just once. Fix this for the family. I looked at the message, then at the city lights outside my condo window, and finally understood the whole war in one sentence. They never feared my anger. They feared the day I would stop translating their image into records. I did not answer him. Some structures do not collapse because someone attacks them. They collapse because the person holding them together finally steps aside and lets the weight tell the truth. The last meeting happened 3 weeks later in Richard Sloane's office, which felt exactly right. By then, even my family understood that anything real between us required witnesses, neutral walls, and chairs arranged on purpose. My mother looked immaculate and diminished, the way people do when prestige has started slipping, but habit still keeps their posture upright. My father looked older. Damien looked like a man trying to stay offended because panic had stopped working for him. No one opened with apology. They opened with damage, sponsor strain, board review, donor concern. My mother said legacy twice, like saying it often enough might turn it back into innocence. I let them finish. Then I said, "You discredited me in public, prepared people to distrust me in private, and kept standing on systems I built after forcing me out. That is why this cracked." Richard asked, carefully, whether there was any path to limited cooperation during the review period. Not reconciliation, not healing, cooperation. Better word, more honest. I looked at my family and understood that what they wanted was not me back. They wanted one last conversion of my discipline into their protection. "No," I said. "You can hire consultants, you can rebuild controls, you can answer for your own records. What you cannot have is me back inside the sequence." Damien let out a short laugh with no humor in it and asked whether I was really willing to let the family drown over principle. I answered, "This is not principle, it is the end of unpaid concealment." After that, the room got smaller in the way rooms do when no one has a believable lie left. My father finally admitted he had confused peace with silence for years because silence had cost him less. My mother said she had not realized how much of the foundation's stability had been resting on me, which was both true and far too late to comfort anyone. I heard them. I just did not mistake hearing for repair. Then I stood, took my coat, and left them there with the one thing they had spent years outsourcing to me: their own consequences. A week later, I signed the lease on a small advisory office of my own near Midtown, bright windows, clean books, no family name on the glass. My phone was quieter, my weekends were cleaner, my work belonged to me again. Nothing in that room had been borrowed, repackaged, or emotionally taxed. For the first time in years, I was unavailable for distortion.